This isn't just a story I'm telling, it's something that happened to me, a chapter of my life I never thought I'd have to write. It's strange how the mind sharpens when everything you love is on the line. The polished mahogany of the mantelpiece felt cool under my trembling fingers, a stark contrast to the suffocating warmth of the room. They were gathered for my 76th birthday, my son Daniel and his wife Clarice, their voices a low, conspiratorial murmur near the bay window overlooking the garden Eleanor had planted. It was right there, in the home I built with my own hands, surrounded by the ghosts of a beautiful life, that I heard Clarice's whisper cut through the haze of feigned celebration. The competency hearing is set for the 15th Drive. Evans is on board. Once he's in the home, this house and everything in it is ours. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. The silence that followed her words was a living thing. It filled the space between the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall and the frantic beating of my own heart. I kept my eyes closed, my breathing even, playing the part of the dozing old man they saw me as. A relic. A piece of furniture with fading memories. But in that moment, every memory I had ever cherished flared to life, not as a gentle comfort, but as a battle standard. The competency hearing. The home. Ours. The words were stones dropped into the placid pool of my grief, and the ripples were spreading fast, distorting the faces of my son and his wife into the monstrous shapes they had hidden for so long. Daniel's reply was a soft, sibilant hiss, thick with the greed I had chosen to ignore for years. Just be patient, Claire. A few more weeks. We have to keep him calm and happy. He gets agitated when he's confused. Confused. That was the word they'd been using for months. When I couldn't find my reading glasses that Clarice had moved. When I forgot a dinner date they'd only mentioned in passing. Each instance was a carefully placed brick in the wall they were building around me, a wall to a prison they called a care facility. This house, standing proud on a quiet, oak-lined street in Charleston, South Carolina, was more than just wood and plaster. It was a testament. I was a young architect when I designed it, every line and angle a love letter to Eleanor. I remembered laying the foundation with her, her hands covered in cement, her laughter echoing in the humid summer air. We chose the heart pine for the floors, reclaimed from a warehouse on the Cooper River. She planted the climbing roses that now covered the east-facing wall, their scent a permanent fixture of my springs. Inside, every object held a story. The one armchair I was sitting in was where she read to me from her favorite books of poetry. The mantelpiece I was touching held a collection of seashells from our first trip to Folly Beach. And on that mantelpiece, next to a faded photograph of Eleanor, sat a small, intricately carved music box made of rosewood. It was the last gift I ever gave her. Daniel and Clarice saw a house. An asset. A prime piece of real estate in a historic district. They didn't see the lifeblood soaked into its very bones. They didn't care. The party, if one could call it that, wound down. Their friends, people with equally predatory smiles and empty eyes, offered me limp handshakes and patronizing birthday wishes. You take care of yourself, Arthur, one of them said, patting my shoulder a little too hard. So good of Daniel and Clarice to look after you. The irony was a physical weight in my chest. When they had all gone, Clarice began clearing away the cake plates with a clatter of forced efficiency. Did you have a nice birthday, Dad? Daniel asked, his voice oozing a false sincerity that turned my stomach. I opened my eyes slowly, letting them adjust to the lamplight. I focused on his face, searching for a flicker of the boy I had raised, the child whose scraped knees I had bandaged and whose fears of the dark I had soothed. I saw nothing but a stranger wearing his skin. A man with a void where his heart should be. It was lovely, son, I managed to say, my own voice sounding distant and frail. It was the first act in a performance I knew I had to master. Just a little tired now. Clarice swept in, her smile a slash of red lipstick. Of course, you are. It's been a big day. Let's get you up to bed. Her hand on my arm was not supportive, it was possessive. A handler leading an animal to its cage. I allowed them to guide me up the grand staircase, my hand trailing on the smooth, worn banister. Each step was a silent vow. They thought the battle was already won. They thought I was a fading photograph, a collection of memories they could catalog, pack away, and sell to the highest bidder. They had forgotten one crucial detail. I was the architect of this house. And I knew the location of every load-bearing wall, every hidden space, every secret it held. And my mind, the one they were so eager to declare broken, was already drawing up a new set of blueprints. Not for a building, but for their complete and utter destruction. That night, sleep was a distant country. I lay in the bed I had shared with Eleanor for 47 years and listened to the house breathe around me. It was waiting. We both were. The secret they thought I'd forget wasn't just about a house. It went deeper, back to the shadowed days of Eleanor's illness, a time of vulnerability they had exploited with chilling precision. They thought my grief had blinded me. But grief, I was learning, doesn't blind. It burns away the trivial, leaving only the essential. And what was essential now was a reckoning. My descent into their fabricated narrative of senility had been a masterclass in manipulation, so subtle at first that even I had begun to question myself. It started a year after Eleanor passed. Simple things, at first. My car keys would vanish from the hook by the door, only to reappear a day later in the refrigerator. "Oh, Dad, you're getting so forgetful," Clarice would tisk, her voice a cocktail of pity and impatience. Then it was appointments. A lunch with my old partner from the firm, Frank, would be mistakenly erased from the kitchen calendar. I'd show up at the Peninsula Grill on North Market Street, wait for an hour, and return home confused and embarrassed, only for Daniel to say, "Dad, we told you that was next Tuesday. You really need to write things down." They were chipping away at my confidence, my reality, one carefully orchestrated incident at a time. I was an old man, after all. These things happen. That's what they wanted me to believe. That's what they wanted everyone to believe. Now, with the threat of a competency hearing hanging over me, I understood it wasn't about my well-being. It was a strategic campaign. The first step in my quiet war was to stop relying on my own memory and start documenting theirs. The morning after my birthday, I feigned a deeper-than-usual confusion. I came downstairs wearing one brown slipper and one black one. Clarice pointed it out with an exasperated sigh. "Arthur, for heaven's sake. Look at your feet." I looked down, blinked a few times, and gave a sad, defeated little laugh. "Well, I'll be. Would you look at that? My mind is playing tricks on me today." The flicker of triumph in her eyes was all the confirmation I needed. While she was on the phone with one of her charity committee members, loudly complaining about the burden of full-time elder care, I made my way into my study. The room was my sanctuary, filled with books on architecture and history, my old drafting table still standing in the corner. Daniel had helped me organize my finances after Eleanor died, consolidating everything into accounts he managed. He brought me statements every month, sitting beside me and patiently explaining the numbers as if to a child. I had accepted it, too lost in my sorrow to care about portfolios and dividends. Now, I needed to see the raw data. I knew he kept copies of everything on a dedicated laptop in his home office. But I had a secret of my own. Years ago, I had insisted on receiving paper statements from the banks and brokerage houses. Daniel had called it archaic. "Dad, it's a waste of paper. Everything is online." But I insisted. And every month, when the mail arrived, I would intercept those envelopes before he could and hide them. My hiding spot was a place they would never think to look. It was inside a hollowed-out copy of Vitruvius's De Architectura, a book they saw as just another dusty volume on a shelf of an old man's forgotten passions. I retrieved the book, my hands surprisingly steady. For the next few hours, I spread 2 years' worth of statements across my drafting table. I put on my strongest reading glasses and began to trace the flow of my money. It didn't take an expert to see the pattern. Small, insignificant withdrawals at first. A few $100s here and there, labeled household expenses or property maintenance. Then the amounts grew. Larger sums moved into a secondary account I didn't recognize. Thousands of dollars. Then tens of thousands. The most alarming discovery was a series of transactions from Eleanor's personal jewelry and art fund, an account I'd set up for her passions. The withdrawals had started a month before she died, a time when she was bedridden and heavily medicated. One transaction stood out, a wire transfer for $50,000 to a gallery in Atlanta known for discreetly handling private sales. I remembered the piece it must have been, a small, luminous landscape by Martin Johnson Heade, a painting Eleanor had adored. Daniel had told me she gifted it to a visiting cousin from her side of the family. He said she was tying up loose ends. The lie was so audacious, so cruel, it stole the air from my lungs. He hadn't just stolen from me. He had stolen from her memory, while she lay dying. This was the secret. This was the original sin I had been too grief-stricken to see clearly at the time. My suspicion back then had been a vague, nagging ache. Now, it was a precise, undeniable certainty. They had gotten away with it once and believed they could do it again, this time on a grander scale. They weren't just after the house, they were systematically draining the entire estate, the legacy Eleanor and I had built over 50 years. My role as the forgetful old man was no longer just a defense, it was becoming a weapon. That afternoon, Daniel came into the study. "Hey, Dad. Whatcha doing?" he asked, his tone aggressively casual. I quickly covered the statements with a blueprint of the Charleston Gallard Center. "Oh, nothing, son. Just looking at some old drawings. Remembering." I sighed, letting my shoulders slump. It's funny, the things you forget. And the things you can't. He placed a hand on my shoulder. The same hand that had signed away my money, that had patted my back with false sympathy. "I know it's hard, Dad. That's why we're here. To help you manage things. You don't have to worry about any of this stuff anymore." I looked up at him, into his placid, dishonest eyes. "What would I do without you, Daniel?" I asked, my voice cracking with manufactured emotion. He smiled, a self-satisfied, predatory gleam in his eyes. "Don't worry, Dad. We'll never let you down." As he walked away, I felt a cold resolve settle deep in my bones. He was right. He would never let me down. He would continue to lie, to steal, and to condescend, right up until the moment I pulled the foundation out from under his entire life. He thought he was managing my assets. In truth, he was just curating the evidence for his own prosecution. And I, his forgetful old father, would be the star witness. I just had to find the rest of the proof before they locked me away and silenced me for good. The first piece of new evidence was a ghost's whisper, caught on a sliver of silicon. I bought the device at a small electronics shop on King Street, a place that catered more to private investigators than to the general public. It was a simple USB charger, the kind you'd plug into any wall outlet. But its true purpose was to listen. It was a voice-activated audio recorder, utterly innocuous and perfectly placed. I chose an outlet in the kitchen, behind the canister of flour, a high-traffic area where they often had their most candid conversations, assuming I was either out in the garden or napping in my chair. The first few days yielded nothing but the mundane chatter of their lives, Clarice complaining about the caterer for an upcoming charity gala, Daniel on the phone with a client, dripping professional charm. They were careful, always performing. But their arrogance was their weakness. They couldn't keep the performance up forever. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning. I was in my study, ostensibly organizing my collection of antique maps, when I heard their voices escalate. I had left the study door slightly ajar, a new habit of mine. "He's asking questions, Daniel," Clarice said, her voice sharp and brittle. "He asked me yesterday where the Heade painting was. I told him what we agreed, that Eleanor gave it to Susan. He just stared at me. It was creepy." Daniel's voice was low, meant to be soothing, but I could hear the thread of anxiety running through it. "It's nothing, Claire. It's just a flicker. A misfire in the old circuits. Dr. Evans said this would happen. Moments of clarity, he called them. They don't last. He'll forget he even asked by this afternoon. A pause. The clink of a coffee cup against the saucer. Is Evans ready? Clarice asked. The hearing is less than 2 weeks away. I want this over with. I want him gone. This time, Daniel's voice was cold, stripped of any pretense. He's ready. I forwarded him the notes on Dad's recent episodes. The slippers, the missed appointments, the time he called you Eleanor. Evans has everything he needs to paint the perfect picture for the judge. He says it's a textbook case of age-related cognitive decline. Slam dunk. A slam dunk. That's what I was to them. A problem to be solved, a case to be won. Not a father, not a husband, not a man. Just an obstacle. The recording from the kitchen charger that evening was even more damning. I waited until they were asleep, the house groaning around me in the deep quiet of the night, before I retrieved it. I slipped into my study, put on my headphones, and pressed play. Their voices filled my head, clear as day. Clarice, did you see his face when I told him we were having the piano tuned? He looked like I'd shot his dog. Daniel, it's for the best. That thing is a monstrosity. Takes up half the living room. It'll fetch at least $30,000. Maybe more. I have a buyer lined up already. Clarice, 30? That's it? For a Steinway? Daniel, it needs work. And we need the liquidity. Dr. Evans' expert testimony doesn't come cheap, my love. Think of it as an investment in our future. Once he's settled at the Palmettos, we can sell off the rest of this junk. No more tiptoeing around. The Palmettos. They had already picked out the place. I knew it. A high-end assisted living facility on James Island. I'd seen the brochures that kept mysteriously appearing in the mail. They called it a resort-style senior living community. I called it a gilded cage. But it was the casual, callous discussion of selling Eleanor's piano that truly broke through my carefully constructed composure. It was a Model B Steinway, a classic grand I had bought for her on our 20th anniversary. She had played it every day. Its music was the soundtrack of our life together, of raising Daniel, of holidays and quiet evenings. The thought of their greedy hands on it, of a stranger haggling over its price, filled me with a rage so pure and cold it felt like ice water flooding my veins. This was the moment. The turning point. The quiet grief I had harbored for years, the simmering anger of the past few weeks, it all crystallized into a single, unshakable resolve. They would not win. They would not erase her. They would not erase me. My war needed an ally. The next morning, I called my oldest friend, Frank Peterson. Frank had been a judge on the circuit court for 30 years before retiring. He was sharp, incorruptible, and one of the few people left who remembered me not as a frail old man, but as the man I once was. We met at a quiet cafe on Broad Street, a place we'd frequented for decades. I looked the part of the confused senior, walking slowly, leaning on my cane, my gaze slightly unfocused. I saw the pity in the eyes of the young barista. It was the perfect cover. Frank's expression was etched with concern as I sat down. "Arthur, you look tired," he said, his voice a low rumble. "They're keeping you busy, are they?" "They're trying to have me declared incompetent, Frank," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I watched his face change. The concern deepened, but the soft pity vanished, replaced by a familiar, judicial steeliness. I told him everything. The overheard conversation, the financial statements, the stolen painting, the plan to sell the piano. I didn't embellish or editorialize. I just laid out the facts, the cold, hard bricks of their betrayal. When I finished, Frank was silent for a long time, stirring his coffee, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cafe window. Finally, he looked at me. "The bastards," he said, the word a quiet explosion. "What do you want to do, Arthur?" "I don't want to stop them, Frank," I said, leaning forward, my voice finding a strength I hadn't felt in years. "I want to annihilate them. I want to use their own arrogance and the very legal system they're trying to manipulate against them. I want them to walk into that courtroom thinking they are about to inherit a kingdom, and I want them to crawl out with nothing but the dust of their own greed. Frank studied my face, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt seen. He saw the architect, the planner, the man who understood that the strongest structures are built on the most solid foundations. A slow, grim smile spread across his face. "All right, Arthur," he said, his voice firm. "Let's go to war. I know a lawyer. She's young, she's hungry, and she eats smug, trust fund sharks like your son for breakfast. Her name is Isabella Rossi." That afternoon, as Clarice was showing a man from a local antique dealership the Steinway, I stood in the doorway, a sad, vacant look on my face. The man, a portly fellow with a clipboard, was assessing the instrument. "There are some minor scratches on the finish, and the action is a little sluggish," he was saying. "But it's a fine piece. I can offer you $25,000, as is." Clarice was trying to haggle, her voice laced with a faux disappointment that barely concealed her avarice. "Oh, that seems rather low for a family heirloom." I watched them, and I felt nothing but the calm, chilling certainty of a predator. They were so focused on the value of the piano they couldn't see the value of the man standing in the doorway. They thought they were selling a piece of furniture. They had no idea they were funding their own downfall. Because the moment they accepted that check, they were no longer just greedy children. They were thieves. And I had a receipt. Frank's description of Isabella Rossi was an understatement. She wasn't just hungry, she was voracious. We met in her office, a sleek, modern space in a high-rise on Calhoun Street that overlooked the harbor. It was a world away from the musty, oak-paneled law offices I was used to. Isabella was in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing and a presence that filled the room. She wore a tailored black suit and possessed an air of controlled intensity that was both intimidating and deeply reassuring. I sat before her, Frank by my side, and for the second time in as many days, I laid out my story. This time, I brought the evidence, copies of the bank statements with my annotations, a transcript of the audio recording, and a detailed timeline of Daniel and Clarice's escalating campaign of gaslighting. I played the part Frank and I had agreed upon. I was the concerned father, heartbroken by his son's inexplicable behavior, worried for my own future but terrified of creating a family scandal. I don't know what to do," I stammered, twisting a handkerchief in my hands. "Daniel is my only son. But I feel like I'm a prisoner in my own home." Isabella listened without interruption, her gaze unwavering. She absorbed every detail, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping a sleek silver pen against a notepad. "Mr. Covington," she began, her voice crisp and precise, "your son and his wife aren't just being cruel. They're engaging in a coordinated effort to commit elder fraud, theft, and what sounds like conspiracy to unlawfully deprive you of your liberty. Their petition for a competency hearing is not a tool for your protection, it's the weapon they intend to use to finalize their crimes." She leaned forward, her eyes locking onto mine. "You're right to be scared. The system is often biased in these cases. Dr. Evans' testimony will carry significant weight. They will paint you as a confused, paranoid old man whose accusations are nothing more than delusions." "So, what can we do?" Frank asked, playing his part. Isabella's lips curved into a faint, confident smile. "We let them build their case. We give them every ounce of rope they need to hang themselves. We will not challenge their petition directly. We will not file a motion to dismiss. We will walk into that courtroom and let them present their entire, beautifully constructed fiction to the judge. And then," she paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room, "we will dismantle it. Piece by painful piece." The strategy was bold, risky, and exactly what I wanted. For the next week, we worked in secret. Isabella filed her appearance as my counsel, a move that Daniel and Clarice saw as a desperate, futile act. Daniel called me, his voice a strained performance of concern. "Dad, I heard you hired a lawyer." "That's really not necessary. We can sort all this out as a family." "I'm just so confused, son," I replied, my voice trembling. She seemed nice. I thought maybe she could help me understand the papers. "Dad, this is exactly what I'm talking about," he said, the frustration leaking through. "You're being taken advantage of. This Rossi woman is an ambulance chaser. Please, just trust me." I promised to think about it, and hung up. The lion was warning the lamb about the shepherd. The arrogance was breathtaking. While they grew more confident, Isabella and I were laying the groundwork for our counteroffensive. She hired a forensic accountant, a quiet, ruthless man named Peterson, who began a deep dive into my financial history, tracing every dollar Daniel had moved. His preliminary report confirmed my suspicions and uncovered even more: a brokerage account in the Cayman Islands, a series of consulting fees paid from my estate to a shell corporation owned by Clarice. The scale of their theft was far greater than I had imagined. My role was to continue playing the victim. I became more forgetful. I would leave the stove on, only to have Clarice rush in and turn it off with a dramatic sigh. I would wander into the garden and stand there for an hour, staring at nothing. Each performance was carefully calibrated to be reported back to Dr. Evans, further cementing their narrative. But my quiet hours were spent on the phone, tracking down the ghosts of my past. The most important ghost was a woman named Maria Sanchez. Maria had been Eleanor's hospice nurse during her final 3 months. She was a kind, observant woman, and I remembered her being uncomfortable around Clarice. I found her through a network of old hospital colleagues. She was retired, living in a small town outside of Asheville, North Carolina. I knew it was a long shot, but I had to try. I rented a car, a simple Ford sedan, and told Daniel and Clarice that a friend was taking me to look at a retirement community in the upstate, a less stuffy alternative to the Palmettos. They were delighted, seeing it as me coming to terms with my fate. The drive up into the Blue Ridge Mountains was the first time I had felt truly free in months. The air was crisp, the scenery beautiful. It felt like breathing again after being underwater. I found Maria in a small, neat house with a porch full of flowers. She was older, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes were the same, clear and kind. I didn't beat around the bush. I told her why I was there. I told her about the hearing and what Daniel and Clarice were trying to do. At first, she was hesitant, reluctant to get involved. "Mr. Covington, that was a long time ago. I don't want any trouble." "Maria," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "I remember you. I remember how you cared for my wife. And I remember you watching Clarice. You saw things. Please. They are trying to erase my wife's memory and lock me away. I need the truth." She was silent for a moment, her gaze distant. Then she nodded slowly. "Your wife, she was a lovely woman. So dignified. Even at the end. She invited me inside and made tea. And then she told me. She told me about Clarice's impatience, her rough handling of Eleanor when she thought no one was looking. She told me about overhearing Clarice on the phone, complaining about how long it was taking for Eleanor to die. The most damning memory was the day Clarice brought in a notary. Eleanor was heavily sedated, barely conscious. Maria had protested, saying Mrs. Covington wasn't in a state to sign anything. Clarice had pulled rank, claiming it was just a minor insurance form, and ushered her out of the room. A week later, a valuable diamond and sapphire brooch that Eleanor always kept in a velvet box on her nightstand was gone. Clarice had claimed Eleanor wanted her to have it. Maria never believed her. By the time I left Maria's house, I had her signed affidavit in my briefcase. It was a first-hand account of Clarice's cruelty and avarice. It was a voice from the past, speaking for the wife they had silenced. Driving back down the mountain, the setting sun painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, I didn't feel tired. I felt focused. I had the financial records. I had the audio recording. Now, I had a witness. The foundation of their lies was beginning to crack. And I was the architect of the demolition. The week before the hearing was a symphony of deception, with me as the conductor. Daniel and Clarice were in the final stages of their plan, and their smugness had curdled into a palpable, triumphant energy that filled the house. They treated me with the cloying, condescending kindness one reserves for a beloved pet that is about to be put down. They made my favorite meals. They bought me a new cashmere sweater. Every gesture was a lie, a final coat of paint on the cage they had built for me. "We're going to get through this, Dad," Daniel said one evening, putting his arm around my shoulder as we stood on the porch. "After the hearing, things will be simpler. Easier for you. No more stress." I leaned on my cane, looked out at the garden Eleanor had loved, and gave a weary sigh. "I hope so, Daniel. I'm just so tired." Inside, I was a coiled spring. My conversations with Isabella were brief and encrypted, conducted via a burner phone I kept hidden in my workshop. The forensic accountant had delivered his final report, a devastating document that laid out a decade of systematic embezzlement, complete with account numbers, dates, and destinations. It was a roadmap of their greed. Isabella had also tracked down the jeweler, an upscale, but discreet, dealer on King Street who catered to Charleston's old money. He remembered Clarice well. She had come in a few days after Eleanor's death, looking to sell a small inheritance. He had a copy of the receipt for the diamond and sapphire brooch. Another nail for Clarice's coffin. The final piece of my trap was social. Clarice had been working tirelessly to climb the ladder of Charleston society. Her current obsession was a fundraising gala for the city's symphony orchestra. She was the co-chair of the event. It was her moment to shine, to solidify her place among the city's elite. 2 days before the hearing, I made my move. I arranged a meeting with my estate planner, a different one from the firm Daniel used, and instructed him to draw up papers for a new charitable trust. That afternoon, a press release was sent to the Post and Courier and every major society blogger in the city. It announced the formation of the Eleanor Covington Memorial Fund for the Arts, an endowment established by her loving husband, Arthur Covington, to support young musicians in the Lowcountry. The initial donation, the release stated, would be a pledge of $2 million, with the first check to be presented to the Charleston Symphony Orchestra at their upcoming gala. The news spread like wildfire. Clarice was blindsided. Her phone began ringing off the hook. Friends, committee members, and local press, all congratulating her on her family's incredible generosity. She had no choice but to play along, to accept the accolades for a fund she knew nothing about, funded with money she was actively trying to steal. I watched her that evening, taking a call from the symphony's board president. Her face was a mask of gracious delight, but her eyes were cold with fury. She was trapped. To deny the pledge would be to expose her family as frauds and humiliate herself publicly. To accept it meant celebrating the donation of money she was counting on for her own future. She cornered me in the library, her voice a venomous whisper. "What do you think you're doing, Arthur? $2 million? Have you lost your mind?" I shrank back, feigning confusion and fear. The man from the bank said it was a good idea. For taxes. For Eleanor's memory. I thought you'd be pleased." "Pleased?" she hissed, her mask slipping completely. "You are an old fool. You have no idea what you've just done." Daniel pulled her away, shooting me a look of pure hatred before schooling his features back into a mask of concern. "It's all right, Dad. You were trying to do a nice thing. You're just confused about the numbers. We'll sort it out. We'll sort everything out very soon." They thought it was a symptom of my senility, a grand, foolish gesture from a failing mind. They couldn't comprehend that it was a strategic move, designed to shine a spotlight on them, to raise the stakes of their public humiliation. They were now the benevolent custodians of a great philanthropist, a role they would have to play right up until the moment the curtain fell. The night before the hearing, the house was still. Daniel and Clarice had gone out to a celebratory dinner with their lawyer, confident of the next day's victory. I walked through the rooms of my home, my sanctuary, my fortress. I ran my hand over the cool marble of the fireplace, over the worn velvet of Eleanor's favorite settee. I stopped in front of the empty space where her piano had stood. A phantom limb, an ache that would never fully fade. I went to my study and opened the rosewood music box, the one I had given her. I wound the small key and opened the lid. A soft, delicate melody filled the silence, Debussy's Clair de Lune, her favorite. They thought they were taking a house. They thought they were liquidating assets. What they were truly trying to steal was the music. The memories. The love that echoed in every corner of this home. But they had miscalculated. An architect knows that a structure's strength isn't just in its visible walls, but in its unseen foundation. My foundation was 47 years of love and a memory as sharp and clear as the winter air. Tomorrow, in court, I would not be Arthur Covington, the confused old man. I would be the architect. And I was about to show them the fatal design flaw in the life they had built on a bedrock of lies. The morning of the hearing, the air was thick with the suffocating humidity of a Charleston summer. I dressed slowly and deliberately in a dark gray suit, the one I had worn to Eleanor's funeral. It felt appropriate. Today was, in a way, another funeral, for the son I thought I had, and the life he and his wife had imagined for themselves. Clarice, dressed in a somber but impeccably tailored navy blue dress, fussed over my tie, her fingers cold against my skin. "You look presentable, Arthur," she said, her voice dripping with the false magnanimity of a victor. "Just let our lawyer do the talking. Be honest with the judge about your memory problems. It's for the best." Daniel stood by the door, jangling his keys, anxious to get to the courthouse and claim his prize. "Ready, Dad?" he asked, the picture of a dutiful son burdened by a difficult task. I nodded, leaning heavily on my cane, and allowed them to lead me from my home for what they believed would be the last time I would leave it as a free man. The Charleston County Courthouse on Broad Street is an imposing building, a monument of stone and authority. As we walked up the wide steps, I felt a tremor of fear, a final flicker of doubt. What if Isabella was wrong? What if the judge saw only what they wanted him to see, a frail, forgetful man, a burden to his loving family? Then I caught Daniel's eye. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible wink, a gesture of shared conspiracy with his wife that excluded and condemned me. In that instant, the fear vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. I was not the one on trial here. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, paneled in dark wood that seemed to absorb the light. We sat at one table, Daniel, Clarice, and their lawyer, a slick man with silver hair named Abernathy. I sat at the other with Isabella, who gave my hand a reassuring squeeze under the table. Frank was seated in the gallery, a silent, stoic observer. The judge, a woman named Eleanor Hayes, a coincidence that felt like a sign from my Eleanor, entered and the proceedings began. Abernathy went first. He painted a masterful picture of my decline. He was sympathetic, his voice filled with sorrow as he described my episodes. He spoke of the missed appointments, the mismatched slippers, the alarming decision to pledge $2 million I supposedly didn't have. He framed Daniel and Clarice as heartbroken children, forced to make an impossible choice for their father's own safety. His star witness was Dr. Evans. The doctor, a man with a kind, trustworthy face and a soul purchased by my son, took the stand. He spoke in medical jargon, citing his examinations and my anecdotal history as provided by Daniel. He diagnosed me with moderate dementia, likely progressing to severe. He concluded his testimony by stating that, in his professional opinion, I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, personal or financial, and required supervised care in a secure facility. It was a flawless performance. I could feel Daniel and Clarice relaxing beside Abernathy, victory within their grasp. Judge Hayes looked at me with an expression of profound pity. Then, it was Isabella's turn. "The petitioners have painted a very sad, very convincing picture, Your Honor," she began, her voice calm and clear. "A picture of a man fading away, and a loving family stepping in to help. Now, I'd like to introduce the court to the truth." Her first witness was Maria Sanchez. When the bailiff called her name, I saw Clarice's face pale. Maria walked to the stand, a picture of quiet dignity. Under Isabella's gentle questioning, she recounted her time as Eleanor's nurse. She spoke of Clarice's cruelty, her impatience, and the suspicious disappearance of the brooch. She described the day Clarice had a notary attend to a heavily sedated Eleanor. Abernathy's cross-examination was aggressive, but Maria remained unshaken. "Next, I call Mr. Julian Croft," Isabella announced. The King Street jeweler took the stand. He identified Clarice and produced a receipt for the sale of a diamond and sapphire brooch, dated 2 days after my wife's passing. The amount was $18,000. A gasp rippled through the gallery. Clarice looked like she had been struck. Next came the forensic accountant. He used a large screen to display the flow of my money. He showed the embezzled funds, the shell corporation, the offshore account. He methodically detailed over $1 million in unauthorized transfers made by Daniel over 8 years. Daniel's face had gone from smug to ashen. He was staring at the screen as if watching his own execution. Then came the masterstroke. "Your Honor," Isabella said, "at this time, the defense would like to play a short audio recording." The clerk produced a small speaker. Isabella pressed a button on her laptop. And then, their voices filled the courtroom. Daniel and Clarice, in my kitchen, discussing the sale of my wife's piano to pay for Dr. Evans' expert testimony. The doctor, who was still in the courtroom, sank lower in his seat, his face crimson. The final words of the recording hung in the air. "Once he's settled at the Palmettos, we can sell off the rest of this junk. No more tiptoeing around." The silence that followed was absolute. Judge Hayes was staring at Daniel and Clarice, her expression no longer one of pity, but of cold fury. "Finally, Your Honor," Isabella said, her voice ringing with power, "I call my client, Mr. Arthur Covington, to the stand." I walked to the witness box, but I did not lean on my cane. I placed it on the floor beside me. I sat up straight. I looked directly at the judge. "Mr. Covington," Isabella said softly, "please tell the court, in your own words, what has happened." And I did. I spoke without notes, my voice clear and strong. I told them everything. I spoke of my love for Eleanor, of the life we built, of the home I designed. I spoke of the fog of grief that had allowed their first betrayal to go unchecked. And then I detailed their campaign to have me declared incompetent, explaining every feigned symptom, every manufactured moment of confusion. I was no longer a victim. I was a narrator, reclaiming my own story. When I finished, Abernathy, looking utterly defeated, had only one question. "Mr. Covington," he stammered, "if your mind is so sharp, what about the $2 million pledge? The forensic accountant's report shows your liquid assets are nowhere near that sum. Wasn't that a sign of your confusion?" I allowed myself a small smile. "That's where you are mistaken, Mr. Abernathy. You and my son only looked at the assets he managed. You never bothered to look into the architectural patents I've held for 40 years, patents for structural engineering designs used in commercial construction worldwide. I sold them last week to a development firm in Dubai. The deal closed yesterday morning." I turned to Daniel. "The total sale price was $22 million. The Eleanor Covington Memorial Fund is very real. Your inheritance, however, is not." The sound Clarice made was something between a gasp and a sob. Daniel simply stared, his mouth agape, his world completely undone. Judge Hayes's gavel came down like a thunderclap. She dismissed the competency petition with prejudice. She stripped Daniel of his power of attorney. And then she looked over the bench at my son and his wife, her eyes like chips of ice. "I am referring this entire case, every piece of evidence and testimony I have heard today, to the district attorney's office for immediate investigation into charges of fraud, embezzlement, perjury, and conspiracy. I suggest you and your counsel remain in the building." It was over. Frank clapped me on the shoulder, his eyes shining. Isabella smiled, a true, brilliant smile. I saw Daniel and Clarice being spoken to by a court officer, their perfect lives crumbling into ash right before my eyes. They had walked into the courtroom as predators. They would walk out as criminals. That evening, I returned home. Alone. The house was quiet, the air still. The triumphant energy of the courtroom had faded, leaving behind a profound and heavy silence. I walked into the living room and stood in the empty space where Eleanor's piano used to be. The victory felt hollow here, in this room full of ghosts and missing music. I went to my study and picked up the rosewood music box from the mantelpiece. I wound the key and lifted the lid. The soft, clear notes of Clair de Lune filled the room, a sweet, sad melody of a life that was. Daniel and Clarice had seen me as a relic, a ghost in my own home, doomed to forget. They thought I was a ghost in my own home, but they forgot that ghosts remember everything. The end.